Hey, everybody, this is Congressman Kelly Armstrong, and I just want to start by saying a huge thank you for grinding out the hard work that is smart, responsible criminal justice reform. Special thanks to my friend Jason Pye for inviting me. Unfortunately, I can't be there in person, but I just want to tell you that no matter how hard it seems sometimes, things are moving. This week, we're going to mark up a Bureau of Prisons oversight reform bill. We've been working on that for the last several years in Congress, and I think we're going to get it through on suspension on the House floor this week. We have an acquitted conduct bill, which I think everybody understands. That's what the Constitution really meant, that we're still trying to move through. But I just really appreciate your willingness to work on both sides of the aisle. For those of you that don't know, I'm a Republican from North Dakota. And I also spent 10 years as a criminal defense attorney and a public defender. Prior to that, I grew up watching my grandmother, who was the head of the North Dakota Mental Health Association for 20 years. This is not a red or a blue issue. This is not a liberal or conservative issue. This is a smart policy issue, and we need to continue to push forward on it. And the reason is because over-incarceration is expensive, it ruins lives, it doesn't solve the problem for the offenders, and it depletes our workforce, and it just continues the cycle of addiction and crime. So thank you for working on this. Remember that I know sometimes this work is not always what is the easiest to get past, particularly in a dysfunctional Congress. But I've been really heartened in my 12 years in public service. The amount of Republicans that have come around on these issues has been fascinating. The amount of Democrats that have been willing to back off things that are really actually bad policy in order to get reasonable common sense reforms has been heartening. Thank you for all you do. I hope you have a great conference. And if you ever need anything, please reach out to my office. This is one of our favorite issues to work on because there's not many times in Congress where you can actually pass legislation that changes people's lives for the better. And that's what we're trying to do. That's what the goal should always be. And when the criminal justice system works best, it has accountability, it has rehabilitation, and it has a little bit of grace. So thank you for everything you all do, and I hope you have a great conference.
I'd like to talk quickly so we can catch up and then get to the meat of this. So I'm gonna race through these bios because frankly I could take the entire hour to talk to you about how great our panelists are, but I won't. David Singleton, who's here with us in the yellow chair, is an associate professor of law at the University of UDC, David A. Clark School of Law, where he now teaches criminal procedure and evidence. Before joining UDC in July of 2023, David served for 21 years as the executive director of the Ohio Justice and Policy Center, a nonprofit public interest law firm that works to reform Ohio's criminal legal system and provides free legal representation to overpunished people. For most of his time in Ohio, he also taught as a professor of law at NKU Chase College of Law. David is also a member of the American Law Institute. To my right, in the turquoise chair, Ed Chung is Vice President of Initiatives and is a member of Vera Institute's leadership team. Ed has 2 decades of legal and policy-making experience, including positions in the White House Domestic Policy Council and the U.S. Senate Judiciary Committee. Prior to joining Vera, he was Vice President of Criminal Justice Reform at the Center for American Progress, where he focused on shrinking the footprint of U.S. criminal justice systems. As a senior advisor at the U.S. Department of Justice, he worked on some of the Obama administration's signature priorities, such as My Brother's Keeper initiative, the Task Force on 21st Century Policing, and ending the criminalization of poverty. Ed started his career as an assistant district attorney in Manhattan and then as a federal prosecutor in the Justice Department's Civil Rights Division. And last but certainly not least, Jason Pye. Prior to joining us here at the Due Process Institute, Jason served as the Vice President of Legislative Affairs for FreedomWorks. He joined us in 2021, bringing many years of lobbying experience to the team. His views on criminal legal reform are partially formed by his own life experiences, the advocacy work he has done, as well as his libertarian/classical liberal convictions. He has worked on several pieces of legislation that have become law, including the First Step Act and the Fair Chance Act. I'm also thrilled to announce today that while he wrote this chapter, he was Director of Rule of Law Initiatives here at DPI, but today he has been promoted to serve as our Vice President. So congratulations to you, Jason.
Thank you, Shana. Yes, it is.
All right, David, I'd like to start with you. You wrote in an essay titled Providing Hope and Freedom to Overpunished People. You write in your essay that you, quote, don't quarrel with the notion that some period of punishment, including prison as time, is appropriate for the most serious crimes, such as murder, end quote. But you also question the value of over-punishment. First, how do we know how much incarceration is enough? And then second, what do you mean by over-punishment?
Well, thank you for the question and for being here. The two questions are hard. And let me actually just back up for a second and say that the hardest sentence in my essay was the sentence about not quarreling with prison time for very serious offenses. Because every single person I represented as a public defender was a human being, and I did not want to see them in a cage for a second, once you see their humanity. And that was across cases, no matter what the person had been charged with or what they had actually done. I recognize, though, that for people who have truly done some harm to others, that socially where we're at on that, and actually, you know, as a good member of the community, I would never want to see someone cause harm to other people. So that was a hard sentence to write, but it's something that I feel is true to who I am and what I believe. In terms of over punishment, I like to think about it in a couple of ways. One is, as a country, our priorities in terms of incarceration are just out of whack. They're out of whack. When, I look to other countries that, for instance, and I get that Finland is a very different country than ours, but they also have human beings there just like we have here. And there, a top sentence is going to be either 12 or 15 years. Norway, it's 21. And here we hand out life sentences like we're giving out candy on Halloween. That, to me, feels wrong, just wrong. Now, someone could come at me with the, what about somebody who cannot control themselves? Let's put those folks perhaps in a different bucket. But people that I have represented and fought to get free, after a period of 10 years, 15 years perhaps, if not a lot sooner, they have learned their lesson and they have transformed themselves in a lot of instances. And so I guess the answer to the question is, I think we have to think about whether we have to continue this practice of giving life sentences, even for the most serious crimes. That's number one. But number two, in terms of when someone is overpunished, my answer to that is, putting aside the question of like how, what the sentence should be statutorily, somebody's overpunished when incarceration no longer serves a purpose that's meaningful. And if someone has transformed themselves, or not even transform, maybe they don't need to transform themselves, they're rehabilitated. They're not a danger anymore. We don't have to worry about them harming someone else. They ought to be free at that point. And that's a look at the individual. It's trying to figure out who they are now, what is different now, and that ought to be the answer.
Ed, I know as a policy advocate, I often find that it's difficult to convince people that a more fair and just approach to social harm can simultaneously coexist with safe communities, which is understandably sort of the bread and butter concern of a lot of Americans who vote. Can you highlight some of the ways we can reduce crime without increasing the punitive practices like incarceration, like over-arresting people, while sort of keeping communities safe?
Yeah. Been prepping for this presentation. First of all, thank you for having me. Thank you, LB, and the Brennan Center team for inviting me to write. But when you prep for it and then you're faced with the question, it just kind of gets your mind thinking, like, my prepackaged answer is just not meeting the moment right now. Because I think there's a few things to consider. What Professor Singleton was talking about is what do we consider safety, and what is our notion of safety? And I think one of the things that we have seen, especially recently, coming out of the pandemic, coming out of a spike in crime and violence, is that too oftentimes we conflate crime and safety and disorder. Because certainly there's a lot of disorder out there that is not necessarily violent. There is disorder out there that makes us uncomfortable, but does that make us not safe? And so when we talk about crime and the criminal legal or criminal justice system as a response to crime, what are we actually talking about as the solution? What are we actually solving for? Are we solving for a sense of safety and peace? Or are we actually solving for actual safety from violent acts, or from acts that are harmful to the person or to property? And so disentangling all of that is really a hard thing for Americans to do generally, because nobody really kind of sits down and thinks about that unless it's affected your life in some kind of meaningful way. And it's really hard for policymakers to sit down and kind of like go, they want to know, like, what's the answer? So this is where I think disentangling some of that, for those of you who are advocates, academics, lobbyists, or whoever it may be, disentangling what we're actually solving for, I think, is a crucial first step in all of this. And then we got to look at, for me, I look at it a few ways. One is, what are the things that are harmful about our system that we just can get rid of and not do more of, and we don't need anything to replace that with? So I look at, for example, the Illinois bail package that was passed last year, and that's been in effect for 9 months or so, right? And that basically it took away cash bail for low-level offenses across the state, first state in the country to really do that. And there was a real concern about what was happening. People looked to Chicago and so forth. And by and large, it wasn't replaced with anything else. They just removed cash bail. There were other things like counsel at first appearance and so forth, which was put in there, but it wasn't replaced with a big infrastructure on top of that. And reappearance rates were relatively the same as when you had a cash bail system. New offenses committed by people who are out was pretty low, under 5%. And so you're seeing things that are harmful about the system that could just be removed, because we all know here in this room like how incarceration prior to trial in jails can cause lifelong harms. And so what are the things that we can identify that are harmful about the system that we can take away? And then there's a whole bucket of things where you actually need to replace parts of the system that you may think are ineffective or harmful with something else. So I'm encouraged, for example, by things like the movement to expand who is responsible for our safety, not only law enforcement, but community-based or public health institutes. So we talk about CVI all the time, community-based violence interventions, or the use of credible messengers, or the use of public health in co-responder models when it comes to how you respond to behavioral health. And those are systems that we create that replace essential functions that were enforcement-based only that create harm. And so, in looking at that, and I know we'll get into this in a little bit, but, how much have we actually done in the last 10, 20, 30 years to build up those systems that actually can take the place of the harmful aspects of our criminal justice system?
Great, thank you. Jason, I know you were an integral part of getting the First Step Act passed. Thank you for that. It was a resounding success. But in your article, which you really sort of walk the reader through what it was like to move that from start to finish, In your article, you point out that since then, Congress has accomplished little in this space. It certainly isn't because there are not enough good bills that have been drafted, put out there, and even moved. It's not that there's not bipartisan support for them. So can you tell us why it's been so hard to actually pass any criminal legal reform legislation since the First Step Act?
Yes, and thank you, LB and Brennan, for inviting me to contribute, and thank you, Shana, for helping us or putting on this event. It's hard to, so First Step Act, when we think back to what that bill was, it was, several different titles, the primary ones being the prison reform title and then the sentencing reform title. I don't think folks really appreciate how hard it was to get that bill through the House and Senate, particularly the Senate. I know just from seeing some folks in the room, my friend Patrick Pertil from Faith and Freedom Coalition can also attest to this. That bill, First Step Act, lived and died 1,000 times before it finally got through. And there were screaming matches with Senate leadership staff. There were long nights of drinking because you're depressed because you think your bill had died. It was highly stressful, but at the end of the day, the success was there. We got it through, but it's an incredibly modest bill. It truly was a first step, and not to sound silly or anything, it really was. There's a lot more we have to do, and there are bills that have been introduced in this current Congress that would do, take the next step, second chance initiatives, and I've seen a couple staffers who are working on some of those bills who are in the room today. Thank you for being here. To make the way a little bit easier for people who have committed an offense to re-enter society, additional sentencing reforms. The biggest problem we face right now in Congress is everything is politics. It's hyperpartisanship. It's the quest for power, especially given very tight margins in the House and Senate. You Democrats are +1 in the Senate. Republicans are, I forget how many members are actually in the House currently. I think it's 431. So I think there are 4 or 5 vacancies, something like that. If memory serves, I think 4. So it's you only have a couple member difference between the two parties. It's in terms of who actually has the gavel, the speaker's gavel. Everybody is pushing for that little sliver of power that they want to have. So crime, and Ed mentioned this, you had a spike in crime in 2020. It's since gone down, but you had a spike, and Republicans capitalized on it, or at least tried to. And I say that as someone who comes from a Republican background, having worked 6.5 years at Freedom Works. They were not as successful as they thought they were going to be, but things like fentanyl, things like the spike in crime, those are all things that became political bludgeons for the other side, which is why we've even lost some moderate Democrats on criminal legal reform issues, things like that. But hope is not lost. I think what Congressman Armstrong said is 100% true. Things are working. Things are going. We're seeing progress on various bills, and he mentioned the Federal Prison Oversight Act, which will be on the floor this week. It's a minor bill, but it's a step in the right direction, and it provides some potential. Well, hopefully, will provide more dignity for people who are incarcerated. But there's no easy way to answer the question. It's just hyperpartisanship, pure politics. The good news is we can change the incentives. We just got to bring down the temperature on the Hill.
Turning back to you, David, in your article, you mentioned that there are some states that have what they call a second look law, although many states don't have one, and the federal system doesn't yet have one. Can you explain what a second look law does, and explain why you think every jurisdiction, including the federal government, needs one?
Yeah, so first of all, let me say I'm a proud member of the Second Look Advisory Network, or Advisory Committee, Advisory Board of the Second Look Network that's housed at the Sentencing Project. And Second Look laws, generally what they do is they allow judges an opportunity to revisit a sentence that is a long sentence and look at who the person is now and whether they are worthy of being released. And I should be clear that there are states that have something called judicial release that apply to people not serving life sentences. Like, let's say that David Singleton here was serving a sentence of 10 years in the state of Ohio. I'd be eligible for judicial release after serving half the sentence. But that's not what we're really looking at with second look laws. We're looking at folks who are serving life sentences. And the other release mechanisms would either be win your appeal, that's not going to happen in most cases, get post-conviction relief, that's probably not going to happen, clemency, that ain't happening. So what do you do for people who have run through their appeals, are not going to get clemency, and they are languishing? Human beings languishing behind bars, rehabilitated, different person in this. They've always had humanity, but that humanity is showing in a different way now. They're rehabilitated. And so parole systems are broken across the country. That's another way that folks can be released. Don't get me going about my experiences dealing with the Ohio Parole Board, because it was just always a frustration of having to relitigate the crime and being kept behind bars because of what somebody did 20, 30, 40 years ago. I've got a client right now I'm trying to get out who's been in since 1976 when I was 10 freaking years old. So what Second Look would do, if we could get it in Ohio, and where it has been enacted in a handful of states across the country, is it gives the judge an opportunity to look at who the person is now and perhaps free that person. In some jurisdictions, the Second Look is prosecutor initiated, meaning the prosecutor is the gatekeeper. And in other places, it's not. It's more broadly open.
For the Hill staffers in the room, I don't think we have a current bill that's been introduced right now, but on the federal level, the Second Look Act.
I think Senator Booker had introduced, if memory serves, Senator Booker had introduced one.
Well, there was one in 2019 and 2022.
Right. I don't think he's reintroduced it in this Congress.
That's exactly what I was trying to say. But the version of that, if anyone's interested, that would have allowed prisoners to petition a federal court. So it was defendant-led for a sentence reduction if they had been sentenced to more than 10 years and they had already served at least 10 years in custody. And then it would put the matter before a judge who would hear from both sides and determine whether it was appropriate. So pretty clean bill, pretty easy bill. I think it's a common sense thing. I'd like to see it reintroduced and become bipartisan and move along. So I know today we're really trying to focus on federal solutions. So I thank you for that, David. I think that's a helpful, good federal solution that ought to be bipartisan led. Ed, by and large in this country, state and local governments, not the federal government, oversee the administration of criminal justice, but still we're here focusing on the federal level. There are ways in which the federal government can influence criminal justice policy. LB, who we heard from earlier today, wrote an essay in the book that highlights how over multiple decades the federal government has played a role in driving prison growth. And Ed, you contributed an essay on the federal government's levers that they could be using to reduce the punitive harms of the justice system. Walk us through a few of your ideas about how the federal government can make the justice system more equitable.
Well, first, I didn't know that there were going to be a lot of Hill staffers or some Hill staffers here. So let me cabin my comments to, which I did in the essay too, to the executive branch. Because obviously, like, if there are opportunities to pass federal laws, that'd be great. But as Jason outlined, right now it's very limited. And so unfortunately, it's pretty limited from the executive branch as well. And if you TLDR, like, it's limited, right? It's like there's not much we can do. That's the point of the essay. Except that I want to highlight three things. One is I mean, there is a federal criminal justice system or criminal legal system that accounts for about 10% of the country's system. It's going down to, but I think that is one place where policies, not only sentencing policies, but policies that the Department of Justice puts forward in terms of what can and should get prosecuted, it affects the system. So whether or not you go for U.S. attorneys, AUSAs, charge the highest possible offense or the offense that results in the longest sentence, or whether they have a more holistic, comprehensive look at what they prosecute. I think that's one aspect of it, and also what happens at the Bureau of Prisons. Obviously, there's an oversight bill that is being considered because the Bureau of Prisons historically has not done those things, has not been a leader in the field where there are other places, for example, where the current BOP director came from in terms of Oregon, leader, North Dakota, a leader in doing prison, in having a different look at corrections and making some changes there. So the federal criminal justice system changes is one. It could impact the overall country's look and policies on criminal justice issues. The other is, we say this all the time in DC about the bully pulpit, but I actually do believe the bully pulpit is something that is really important. You look at what happened at the second term of the Obama administration, even in the Trump administration, these were issues that were being talked about constantly. And it was something that affected how the country talked about and viewed and saw as important criminal justice issues. And this is not to say that the 20, 30, 40, 50 years before, there was a lot of work going on locally and in states and so forth. But when it gained national prominence was when you had presidents talking about it, when you had attorneys general talking about it, and when there were executive decisions that were being made because of those priorities that were being placed. And so the bully pulpit does actually matter to me in this case, because one of the things that I think I would disagree with the current administration was coming out of the pandemic and the spikes in crime. They did a lot when it came to, and I give them a lot of credit for talking about a more comprehensive and holistic way to public safety. There hasn't been much said about the system itself and the need to continue to shrink and look at the effectiveness and the fairness and whether there's justice in the system. And so you also see a lot of people work, and there's a lot of conversation about the tail end and reentry. There always has been. But so if you're talking about the front end and the back end, but you're not talking about what's happening actually in the system, that's when you see some disinvestment and disinterest in those types of policies. And the last quick thing I'll say is the federal government has grants that it gives out. And that's really where I focused in the book, which is the money that goes out to support state and locals, to support groups that come together and develop policies and work with state and locals. I think that's really a place where throughout administrations you can really push policy change.
And just very quickly, is there something about that who gives the money and who's making the decisions that you particularly take issue with?
Yeah, I think so. So there's some decision making about how, who gets to look at and be consultants and peer reviewers of some of these grants that go out. And historically, it's been like, I work for a national nonprofit, so it's been places like that. More and more, there's been a slight changes and more improvements about people who are impacted, local communities, people who represent, where the harm has been, and those kinds of decision making, it's great to have it as advocacy groups. We need more advocacy groups like that. But how do you start embedding that more into governmental decisions that affect policy and that affect budgets and that affect funding?
Jason, I know there's probably at least a dozen bipartisan criminal legal reform bills right now that have real merit and that you are spending the lion's share of your time trying to move. But sitting here right now, we don't have enough time to go over all of those. So give me your top three, the top three pieces of federal legislation that you think are the most effective vehicles for bipartisanship, at least sitting here right now.
So you asked for 3. I actually wrote down 5. So the first, the top 3 are, the first is the Federal Prison Oversight Act, which we mentioned already. That bill will be on the floor this week. It cleared House Oversight 41 to 1, I think, back in April, which, tremendous show of bipartisan support. I expect that we'll see a pretty good vote out of the House this week, and just to purposes of recognizing the members who are leading this effort, that's Lucy McBath and Kelly Armstrong on the House side, and then on the Senate side, it's Senator Ossoff, who is from represents my home state of Georgia, go Dogs, and then Senator Mike Braun, and again, we expect a pretty strong vote this week. Also, I'd be remiss if I didn't mention the Clean Slate Act. This is H.R. 2930, which is Blunt Rochester and Mace on the House side. Lisa Blunt Rochester, future Senator Lisa Blunt Rochester, I should say, Congresswoman Nancy Mace. We are waiting on a Senate companion for that piece of legislation. It should come any day now, we think, but working very diligently to get to raise awareness of that bill, to drive up the number of co-sponsors. That's something I've spent a lot of my first quarter and into the second quarter doing. And then finally, the Safer Supervision Act. And I saw one of the staffers who's working on this bill walk in earlier. This is Hunt and Jackson Lee, Owens, Ivy, Donalds, Armstrong, and Trone on the House side. And then on the Senate side, it's Senators Chris Coons and John Cornyn. If you want explanations of what each of these bills do,
Talk a little bit about the last one. Just explain very quickly what it's doing.
if you want any explanations of what each of these bills do, it's not that I don't want to talk about it. It's just that I know we're pressed for time, and I really want to take some audience questions. These bills are all very important in their own way. I'm setting up a ton of meetings. If you're on the Hill, if you're in a House or Senate office and you're interested in any of these issues, please come see me. I'd love to talk to you about these bills. Each of these bills are very important. And then the 2 honorable mentions, the Equal Act, of course, and then the Fresh Start Act, which is Equal being a sentencing reform bill, and Fresh Start being a second chance piece of legislation. So would love to talk more in depth about these. I'll be around until about 4 o'clock today. So by all means, come talk to me.
Well, and I would have liked if we had had even more authors from this book here. Obviously, we can only take up an hour of your time. So there's notepads in front of everybody. You can write this down. Wanted to reference some chapters in the book that provide more conversations that are really important background to the bills that Jason just mentioned. And obviously I hope you read the entire book, but if you're going to read it chapter by chapter, I'd like to recommend Collateral Consequences and the Enduring Nature of Punishment by Cameron Kimball and Ames Grower. Ames is here. I don't know if Cameron is here? No? Okay. Then another one I'd like to strongly recommend is Probation and Parole as Punishment by Peggy McGarry. I think it would, get to your point, David, that the probation system is just utterly broken, and it seems designed to return our citizens the second they've come out right back in, not designed to help set up people for success, which I think is what it was intended to do and what I think courts pretend it does, but it really doesn't, which is why there are a number of bipartisan folks on the Hill who have introduced a bill that would help address some of its worst problems. And then also I'd like to recommend A Culture of Abuse in Our Nation's Prisons and Jails by Kathy Fuller-Morse. She speaks from a first-hand account of some of the abuse she faced in prison. It's harrowing, but it's important for people who have not spent any time in jail personally to read and to understand and to know what happens there. And last, there was another chapter that really spoke to me, and I think criminal legal reform advocates sometimes leave behind the conversation about victims or survivors of crime, and I want to make sure that we aren't doing that, because I don't think anybody who does this work doesn't want that community of people to, well, first of all, not exist. And then second of all, certainly to have their needs met and to be part of the process. I think some people might be surprised as you read this chapter in the book to find out that that victims might not actually just want the most amount of jail time possible for the perpetrators. So I think it's in Lenore Anderson's chapter, she discusses how the umbrella of criminal justice reforms should also include reforms needed to address the needs of victims or survivors of crime. Sadly, because we don't have her here, we can't ask her to discuss, but I was wondering if Ed and David, you could kind of bat it around this a little bit, because Ed, you were a former prosecutor, and David, you were a public defender, and I know that you are working with victims now in your program, Beyond Guilt Project. So can you speak a little bit about what you've learned from working with victims, both of you? Do they in fact value retribution above all else, as I think a lot of people presume that they might? Do they just want to see the perpetrator of the crime put away for the harshest punishment possible, for the longest amount of time possible? I'm hoping you can give voice to some of that.
So from my prosecutor lens, I think there's always, when after you obtain a conviction, there's and throughout the process, especially if it's an offense that is affecting a person, a victim especially, there are technical ways that prosecutors have historically tried to get the victims or have made attempts, and also has requirements to get the victim's view and victim statements and so forth. Those are very limiting because it's really about they're usually at sentencing at time. There's a chance for the victim to come and speak about the harm that was caused and so forth. But it's limiting because not only of the process, but it's limiting because the options of how to hold people accountable have always been limiting. So you're asking a victim to come in and a survivor to come in, or a victim's family, to say, here's a binary choice between two things. It's either this long sentence or this sentence that's usually long, or non-prosecution. There may be an option of probation at some point, depending on what the offense is, but that's the choice that is given to survivors or to victims and victims' families. And so I think what Lenore and her organization has done really well is to take a holistic view and ask more than just the question of punishment or non-prosecution, or whatever these kind of like binary approaches. And so I think their surveys that they have done, the research that they have done in working with crime victims has been really eye-opening for the field. And then it also then goes to how the public views it. So if you see public polls and public survey instruments that give more options than just enforcement and just the criminal justice system, I think you see results like that. Vera, our sister organization, Vera Action, has some of that polling available. And so the real duty upon policymakers, I think, is to create more of those options and not just have it be a binary choice.
Yeah, I would agree with everything that Ed said, and particularly commend Lenore for her work and her organization's work. One of the things that always gets my goat is when you see prosecutors stand up in the community and act like victims and survivors of crime speak with one voice only, and that's just not true. Have I had cases where we've been trying to get people out of prison after decades, where some members of the victim's family are dead set against it? Well, yeah, that happens a fair amount. But there have also been times where the family of someone who was murdered says, I think this individual has served enough time. And one case in particular was quite moving. It was a case we did in Minnesota. And a woman, Danielle Jones, had lost her son to murder. And the person I represented, Jerome Nunn, was the man who took her son's life. But over time, she wrote Jerome and said, "I forgive you," which was quite amazing. And over time, they developed a relationship. And she was instrumental in getting him clemency, because she basically took the view that I may have lost my son to violence, But I didn't lose the ability to be a mother. And she looks now at Jerome. They have gotten so close that she considers him her spiritual son. Now that might be, I'm not saying that's the norm. Not saying that's the norm. But the point is that there are a range of ways that people who have either been harmed themselves or have lost someone to violence feel about the person who caused the harm. And it's not all lock them up and never let them come home.
That narrative just gave me chills. I thank you very much for sharing it. I know that in her chapter, she also, she spends a great deal of time talking about, I think, what survivors of crime want most is to not have been asked to survive their crime or be asked to deal with the consequences of losing someone else they love. And so they see us spending an awful lot of money and time and effort in just trying to incarcerate our way out of the problem and seeing that it doesn't work. And so I commend to you to her chapter. She talks a lot about where the investments need to be made in order to prevent them from being victims and survivors of crime to begin with. They want to see violence prevention, mental health services, trauma recovery, job training, drug addiction treatment, over things like more arrests and more incarceration. So I commend that chapter to you as well. I think I've run out of time to ask questions, even though I have at least 5 more.
I would just like to make a quick remark about this stuff because, as I mentioned, I come from a conservative Republican background on this stuff, and Shana mentioned also that kind of classical liberal libertarian views on the vast majority of things. If you work on the Hill, I mean, you're coming up on another season of appropriations, FY 2025, fun times. I'm sure there won't be a CR in September, and this won't get kicked back into March. We'll be doing the same stuff we just did all over again. We get in we hear these conversations about federal spending, and this is where I get my fiscal conservative libertarian hat on and lecture you Hill staffers. In 5 years, not even 5 years, you're going to have to start to make some real choices on federal spending. This conversation about discretionary spending, that's 26% of all federal spending. Everything else is entitlement programs, mandatory spending, interest on the national debt. That's on autopilot. That's baked in the cake. At some point, because those programs are going to grow, you're going to have to get smart about the dollars you spend on the discretionary side. That includes the Federal Bureau of Prisons. And you're going to have to start asking yourself, does it make sense when you're starting to look for ways where you can cut back and do so effectively and smartly without jeopardizing public safety or other things? You're going to have to say, man, does it make sense to send these people back to prison for 5, 10, 15, 25 years life, some of whom are getting excessive penalties simply because they demanded a jury trial, the trial penalty. You're going to have to start asking yourselves questions. How is the best way to effectively spend that money? It's not going to be incarceration. That is not an effective way to spend money. There are some people we have to incarcerate. Yes, that's true. But there are, by and large, we got to stop locking up the people we're mad at and focus our resources, what limited resources we have and what limited resources we're going to have in the future on those people. That's all I'll say.
Thank you, Jason. I'd like to turn it over to any of you if you have questions. Sure, go ahead.
So I was listening to the conversation about victims and their wants and their needs versus the wants and needs of people who are charged with crimes. And I was thinking about how, even in this conversation, we are still creating this false binary, right? Because, so I'm a person who represents people under the second law and hear these. And every single one of my clients
That's a tremendous question. Please go take it. So I would say it this way. I think if we look at if we're looking at systemic issues, and we're looking at the criminal justice system in and of itself, we're doing a disservice to what you're talking about, right? So there's a lot, and I think the way that I would look at it, from the things that I guess I'm most interested in my career and so forth, is what other systems, both governmental and others, are adjacent to and affect all of the things that you're talking about. And how do you talk about those things, and how do you discuss them and discuss policy without getting so far into like theoretical, idealistic about root causes that it doesn't make it practical for the moment? And so I think for me, when we talk about, I look at it this way. We talk about reentry, for example, and if you ask anybody in this room, left, right, or whatever, and you ask them what creates what are the principles of reentry that makes for a quote unquote successful life after involvement with the justice system, you probably hear things like good jobs, healthcare, housing, stable life, and so forth, and things like that. What you won't hear are as much, I don't think, are incarceration, like the threat of incarceration or policing or enforcement and things like that. And so I look at, for example, those types of things that we can all agree on for people coming out of the system, and say, why don't we apply that to the front of the system so that the harms that you're talking about of people who either commit an offense or people who are both victims and then go on to commit something else, why don't we look at those specific things as policies and work on those on the first side of the problem? So instead of on the second, this is the whole first chance instead of the second chance issue. And so, but it's a really great question about how do you stop that cycle and what investments are needed to stop that cycle? Because going back to something I think I said earlier, this is one of those things where you have to invest in order to stop the cycle. It's not just about undoing harm. It's in my perspective, investing in people and in communities where harm has already been done in order to stop the perpetuation of that. And so it's an unsatisfactory response because it's a really deep question that I think deserves kind of like it's a real question. Look about government, community, systems, history, and all of that. But I agree with your assessment at least, and I apologize for my unsatisfactory response. But, yeah.
Before David answers, I guess to like kind of further feel, and I guess what I'm talking about is like, we go through a trial, we get to a sentencing, and really a sentencing is a re-traumatization for the victim, the like quote legal term victim, and for the client who just has to sit there and take it, because we're not considering even at sentencing, even the best sentencing, right? We're not considering the depth of the harm that my client has also experienced to get to that point. And then to kind of like bring that up is even more kind of devastating and harmful to the victim, the legal term victim, because it feels like we're making excuses. It feels like no one is like, it almost feels like a silencing of one party or the other. And so I guess what do we do about like that kind of issue?
LB, for the next iteration of the book, make sure Destiny is included as an author. Thank you for your question. And let me say this, because, and I don't know if this is going to be satisfying, but one of the things that is so frustrating to me right now is having that conversation in a big way is being shut down. It's never taken off, but it's even more so now because you've got people saying, I don't want to hear that woke stuff. I don't want to hear about the sob story about how Mr. Smith didn't have this and didn't do that, or didn't have this growing up. And it's just ignoring reality. It's ignoring reality. The story I told you about Jerome, I didn't tell you his story of trauma, which in part is why Miss Jones sees him as her son. That was all part of the advocacy. And she was able to hear it, and the prosecutor was able to hear it, but often that doesn't get heard. And here's the thing that, and maybe I'm using your question to make a point I've been itching to make, and forgive me for that, Destiny. But I think for those of you who are staffers, I know you're busy, and I don't know if you've done this already or not. Find your way into a prison. Find your way into a jail. Find the time to have a conversation with the human beings that we are talking about. Because you can't help but see the fullness of that person, including their strengths, their weaknesses, their trauma, their overcoming of trauma to a certain extent. And there's no substitute for that. There is no substitute for that. Because once you see that, oh my goodness, does that reframe the issues? It's not just, and I agree with what Jason said about make sure that as you're thinking about, are there ways to cut money from discretionary spending, that you're looking at the Bureau of Prisons? And at the same time, know that we're talking about human beings. That's so important. And if anybody wants to come and be part of a class at the DC jail that I'm involved in teaching, come. And that'll at least be some way to see what we're talking about.
Part of the fun of working at Due Process Institute is that we all are politically schizophrenic. So I myself am politically as opposite from Jason as I can possibly be. So he wants the federal government to stop spending money. I just want to change what it's spending money on. I want it to spend more, more, more. And one of the things it would be spending on is trauma recovery, trauma prevention, and trauma recovery in neighborhoods where this is starting when people are 2 and 3 and 4 and 6 and 11 and 12. We do very little. We have known since the 70s about this thing called the ACE score, which is essentially, you go through the list of a variety of kinds of traumas the child can experience, from divorce to loss of a parent to whether they see violence in the home, et cetera, to whether they have an incarcerated parent. You take that score, you have children who are regularly scoring 7 out of 10, 8 out of 10, 9 out of 10, 10 out of 10. And since the 70s, we've known that those are the persons who are most likely to be incarcerated later. But they started off as hurt, harmed children. So I would love to see us spending more money there. And wait, Jason. And in order to maybe, hopefully, help them as human beings, because that's the right thing to do, but also recognizing that potentially we are decreasing our population of offenders later by doing that. And then also something that we do spend quite a lot of time on is actually also trying to prevent even more violence in prison themselves. Once people are incarcerated, these are cesspools of violence and degradation, and doing what we can to bring oversight to that problem, to maybe try to force change in those systems. And then also trauma recovery when people are coming out, because they are coming out. Most people come out of prison and return to their communities, and they're returning whether they were harmed before they went in. They've certainly been harmed by that process, and they're coming back out. And why wouldn't we want to wrap our arms around them and make sure that they feel safe and that they have gotten some trauma recovery from their experience as well, so that they don't reoffend, and also so that they don't have miserable lives. Go ahead, Jason.
I was just going to say, one, I want to take you up on that. I would love to come and experience that. The other thing is, Shana mentioned from my bio that one of the reasons, like my opinions on criminal justice reform, criminal legal reform, are shaped by life experiences. I lost my father at the age of 12. My life could have turned out very, very differently, and I am very well aware of that fact, especially given the crowd I hung out with. I grew up playing in bands and music, and was exposed to a lot of different things that I very easily could have taken a wrong turn at some point. Thankfully, I didn't. One of the silver linings of the pandemic, I think, is that it raised mental health as an issue, raised awareness to it as an issue, and I don't. You mentioned this is what got me on this, this stream of thought is that when you mention the word woke, it's one, nobody knows what the hell it means. Two, we have to. The notion of putting yourselves in the shoes of another person, whether they're someone who's committed a crime, someone of color, someone who may be part of the LGBTQ community, whatever that person is, like the notion that that is somehow wrong in some way, woke, if you will, boggles my mind that we've devalued each other to that point. And I know not everybody here, even my friends who are here who are conservatives, I don't lump them in this category. But there are 217, 218 members of the House, Republican members of the House of Representatives, 49 Republican members of the United States Senate, who are incentivized, not all of them do this, but they are incentivized to play to their base by talking about that stuff. Collectively, sounds like communism, but okay. Collectively, we have a responsibility to start treating each other as humans and not as, well, sounds woke, so I'm not interested. You're not a real person anymore. Sorry. It's just, that stuff irks me, and maybe it's too much exposure to Shana, I don't know, or Ames, but I don't know, I see humanity in other people. I wish everybody did.
Jason, you have made me a self-loathing progressive, and I think I've made you a self-loathing libertarian, and that is why we work so well together. Thank you, everybody, for your time here. If you would like any of the authors to sign your book, I'm sure that they would be happy to. Just come on up. And again, we had a lot of people register who weren't able to make it, I guess, and so we have more food than we like, so please feel free to take another plate with you, to chow down in the back and talk to whoever's here. Thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate it.